Who are you? I thought there'd be like 4 pilots here or something like that. We have there's kind of a good news, bad news scenario here. The bad news is that there's about 50 or 60 slides I got to get through, and the good news is that I've had about 3 cups of coffee and 2 Sudafed this morning, so we may be done in about 5 minutes. Okay? So slow me down if I'm moving too fast. The main point that I wanted to get to, and I suspect I have a diverse audience here. Tim, you got your work cut out for it because you know I don't stand still. I suspect I have a diverse audience here. So pieces of this may relate to your particular job position and others may not, but hopefully in the course of it you'll understand yourself not only as a worker but also as a human being relative to this whole sleep-wake question. And my whole emphasis here today is to try to convince you and talk to you about the fragileness of this sleep-wake system within our bodies and how we have a large gray area in between that we all need to be paying some attention to when it comes to our own personal safety. How many of you are aware of this accident which happened at Chicago back in March of this year? An operator of this commuter train, one of the trams that runs underneath the Chicago O'Hare Airport, acknowledged that she dozed off before the accident and had also done so last month when she overshot the station platform. In Monday's accident, which injured more than 30 people, she woke up only as the 8-car train jolted onto the platform and barreled up an escalator leading into the airport. The accident occurred around 3 a.m. as the driver was nearing the end of her shift. The woman had an erratic work schedule, and investigators were looking to see whether that may have played a role in her evident fatigue. What do you think? Anybody here have an erratic work schedule? You all do, or most of you do? Here's one a little bit closer to home in Cincinnati. In March of 2013, Elizabeth Jasper, who was one of our Mercy nurses, was killed when her car veered off the road, jumped an embankment and struck a tree. She may have fallen asleep at the wheel. She had been an RN in the bone marrow transplant unit at the Jewish hospital. Who's rubbing my shoulders? I like that, thank you. More water, please. All right. Back in, where was it, 2012, the National Sleep Association did a national survey regarding sleep in America, which is what they call the poll every year, but in this particular year they looked at planes, trains, automobiles, and sleep. To cut this down, I just focused on pilots, and I realized I have more than pilots here, but let's just look at them for a minute here. On an average workday, they slept 6 hours and 59 minutes, which is about average for Americans. Most Americans are getting about 6 hours and 50 minutes of sleep per day. Let me take a second here. Who are my 8-hour-a-day sleepers in the room? Wow, a distinct minority. Who wants to be an 8-hour sleeper? Okay, everybody, good question, sir. All right. Is this even a reasonable question of this group? Okay, does your amount of sleep vary day by day, night by night relative to your work schedule? Okay. How many of you are not getting enough sleep on a regular basis, would you say? How many of you are catching up on your days off? Okay. The hours per shift average was 10.4 hours. This is of the planes, trains, automobiles, et cetera. The pilots had the longest commute time, which may be familiar to you guys because you don't usually keep planes and helicopters in your driveway, and so it takes a while to get to wherever you're going to start your workday. 20% had made a serious error at work, and 6% had had an accident on their car accident on their way to or from work. The whole idea of sleep, fatigue, and transportation and safety is huge, and you see it all the time these days in the newspapers. Somebody told me yesterday, did an airplane crash in a house in Chicago, something like that? I didn't read it, but I suspect if you pay attention to that over the next upcoming weeks and months that you'll find some potential sleep-related or fatigue-related issue at the core of that one as well. It's happening all the time. This is obviously what we're trying to avoid. In addition to flying, you're also taking care of patients, I would assume. So we have medical personnel in the room as well. And this is a huge problem within the medical community these days, the idea of the impact of sleep and fatigue on the decisions and the work that we do in the delivery of health care. It's one thing if I have a sleep-deprived cashier at Speedway who gives me, an extra dollar change, all right? But it's a whole different story if I got a nurse who's sleep deprived who's giving me an extra 100 milligrams of sub-medication that I don't need. I forgot to read that. Your patients become the enemy because they are the one thing that stands between you and a few hours of sleep, said an anonymous medical resident who I would suggest remain anonymous, actually. When we look at hours of sleep versus medical errors, here's the interesting dynamic. When we, work hours per week are over here. When we hit, obviously, a high work hours per week, the amount of sleep we're going to get is going to decrease accordingly. And the medical errors here are certainly are increasing the less hours of sleep we get per night. Till we get to the point here of significant medical errors, serious medical errors versus staff conflicts. That's another thing, staff conflicts. One of the things we know about the lack of sleep is that it doesn't put us always in the best mood and in the best condition to tolerate our coworkers. Right? Anybody have a coworker that irritates them? No, him? Yeah. You guys work together? No. Sometimes. Okay. All right. But sometimes he can be a pain in the ass, correct? Oh, yeah. Okay. Our ability to put up with other people and the frustrations that come with our jobs decreases significantly when we're not getting enough sleep at night. Here's an interesting study done in 2006. 1 out of every 5 interns admitted to making a fatigue-related mistake that injured a patient. 1 out of 20 interns admitted to making a mistake that resulted in the death of a patient. All right, now we're talking significant problems here. There's been a ton of work done with nurses and the errors that might be related to their work hours as well. These are the types of problems that come up in research like this. Gave digoxin to the wrong patient. Dosage calculation was completely wrong. A lot of dosage problems there. But you could see that as the duration of work hours increases, the number and significance of medically related errors increases as well. So we're talking about our own personal safety. We're talking about the safety of the patients that we care for, as well as those people out there in the public that we tend to drive next to on an expressway and things of that sort. So what is this fatigue thing? Fatigue is an overwhelming sense of tiredness, a lack of energy, and a feeling of exhaustion associated with impaired physiological and psychological functioning. What causes it? All right, now I'm a sleep guy. All right, and my life is, revolves around the world of sleep and sleep disorders. And, if you ask my wife and my family, they'll say, can't you please talk about something different than sleep? But sleep deprivation is the biggest cause of fatigue. Sleep disorders are another big cause. We'll talk about that as well today. But I do need to make mention of the fact that when we talk about fatigue, we're talking about some non-sleep related issues. In particular, stress has an amazing impact on us in terms of our fatigue. I do lots of talks like this, and I've gotten pretty used to it. And when I'm done, I'm exhausted, all right? Because I'm on stage and there's some pressure and there's some anxiety that comes with it inevitably. And when I'm done with that stressful hour or so, I am pretty much spent for a while until I can recuperate. And that's just coming entirely from stress. It's not the hardest work that I have to do, but it's just the stress level that happens within our body physiologically that leads us to feel that sense of fatigue. I'm a psychologist at my core training here, and we used to still talk about the ABCs when it comes to the effect of certain things in our life. So what I want to do is spend a few minutes talking about what is the impact of fatigue relative to these ABCs. And the first category there is affective. In other words, our mood, our attitude, our general feeling is impaired as a result of not getting enough sleep and being fatigued or sleep deprived. We are irritable, we lose our empathy, and we generally lack motivation to do things. I always think it's interesting because, when you see little kids who are like 2 years old or 3 years old and they're out at a store with their mother and father and they're pitching a fit and throwing a temper tantrum and rolling around on the ground and crying, somebody will always say, they just need to go home and have a nap. right? That'll help them out, that'll be. But when was the last time somebody came up to you in the workday and said, honey, just go take a nap, you're being a real bitch, okay? I mean, you don't get that from people, right? No, it doesn't happen. It probably should happen in the middle of the day, but it ain't happening. From a behavioral perspective, we have the main thing is kind of a lack of impulse control. We all have impulses to be angry, to be aggressive, to do things that we probably shouldn't do, but we check those. We keep those in check, and we control our impulses because we know better cognitively that we shouldn't do these things. However, this is one of the first things to go when we talk about sleep deprivation and fatigue, is we have a difficult time controlling our impulses that we can better control when we've had a good night of sleep. Diminished reaction times, trouble communicating, all right, getting the right words out, getting your message across to people seems to get impaired. And from a safety perspective, when we talk about diminished reaction time, how much of your jobs, whether you're a pilot, whether you're a medical personnel, I don't know who else I got in the room here, but how much of it depends on you making a quick decision and reacting and being aware of your environment. All right? Just driving here today, you have to be aware of your environment. Where's the rest of the cars on the road? Do I put on my brakes? Do I accelerate here? Do I change a lane there? All these things are extremely important when it comes to reaction time, and that gets diminished when we talk about sleep deprivation. From a cognitive perspective, we generally just tend to get stupider when we're not sleeping well. We have problems with attention, concentration, memory, learning. All those things are deeply impacted by a night of poor sleep or a chronic sleep deprivation problem. Did you know, okay, this comes from some research which is highly cited back in 1997, that if you're awake for 24 hours in a row, you have the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.1. In Ohio, 0.08 is the blood alcohol concentration that's necessary to be called legally drunk. How many of you have worked more than 24 hours in a row? Now, you all think that's normal, don't you? Why does that happen? I mean, pardon me? Because you like it. What do you mean you like it?
We like having that schedule that we can have a 24-hour shift.
Because why? Because it means you're off for how much? 48?
You might only work 2 days a week and it's full-time.
Okay. And how do you do when you get to hour 16, 17, 18?
We're not always awake the whole time.
Okay. Tell me what it's like. Help me understand what a day would be like. What's your role, please?
I'm a flight nurse.
Okay. And you sit and wait for calls? Okay. And so you're like, my dad was a fireman. So you're like a fireman who sits at the station waiting for a call, works a 24-hour shift, and some days that can mean sitting around a lot, and some days that can mean constant activity? I can get it. I can get it. All right. So this causes me concern because we know what alcohol does to our impairment, our judgment. We know what it does to our reaction times and things of that sort. So this is the same kind of category we're talking about here. Now, don't freak out. This is not all that difficult. That's a brain, okay? That is a brain. All right. What I want to point out is that in your brain, you have these orange dots here, which are basically arousal centers, all right? So it's taking in impulses from your eyes and your other sensory modalities, and it's feeding everything up to these arousal centers, which activate some nerves, which keep your whole brain alive, well, and alert and awake, okay? That's the way it's supposed to work. That's all good. After a certain level of activity, after a certain number of hours of being awake, there's this thing over here called the VLPO, the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus. Did I get that right? Ventrolateral preoptic nucleus? I tried to memorize it. Okay. Which starts shutting these arousal centers off, which then shut off your brain. The thing that I tell people all the time, which is important to remember, is that, dangerous up here, is that the idea of falling asleep is much more a function of turning off wakefulness than turning on sleepiness. And that's the problem that a lot of people have when it comes to sleep. They can't turn off being awake. Their mind's too active, they're processing their prior day, they're anticipating their upcoming day, and as a result, the mind is active and these arousal centers never shut off, and as a result, the brain never fully falls asleep. The whole concept, though, of whether or not you are awake or whether or not you are asleep is a very fragile balancing act within your body and within your nervous system. The transitions occur rather rapidly. If I come up to you tonight when you're asleep, what's your name, sir, Jeff? And I whisper in your ear, which I'm not inclined to do, all right? I say, Jeff, all right? You will probably wake up, all right? So you're sound asleep. I come up and whisper Jeff in your ear, and you wake up. That didn't take much stimulation to get you going again, correct? All right. So pulling somebody out of sleep into wakefulness, not too difficult. But I think the major point I'd rather make today is taking somebody who's awake and pulling them into sleep, not too difficult either. All right? It does not take a lot to tip this scale in the direction of sleep, even though you're considering yourself to be in the middle of your workday and quote unquote wide awake. As soon as one or the other of these forces become dominant or overly strong, the scales are tipped. And let's talk then about two of the main factors that determine what state we're in at any given point during the day. Oh yeah. This is what we want to avoid here, okay? Trips into the twilight zone. What causes sleepiness? All right, there's basically two processes that cause and determine whether or not you're awake or whether or not you're asleep throughout the daytime hours and nighttime hours. We have an insufficient quantity of sleep, which is what you people are talking to me about due to extended work hours, and it looks like I missed a letter there, cumulative days of extended work. Insufficient quality of sleep, we'll talk about that. How long it's been since the last episode of sleep, and then these underlying circadian rhythms which drive this whole thing. This is how it looks. You have two functions in your body. One's called the homeostatic drive for sleep. It is up top here. Homeostatic drive for sleep, pretty common sense. Homeostatic drive for sleep says you will be more sleepy the further away you are from your last episode of sleep. Make sense? All right, so if you have an 8-hour shift and you're not too far away from your last episode of sleep, you won't be that sleepy. 12-hour shift, more. 24-hour shift, obviously it's been a long time since your last episode of sleep, and you will be increasingly sleepy throughout that time period. So this gets increasingly strong throughout the daytime hours and determines how sleepy we generally feel. When it comes to work issues, this is where we start talking about the length of our shift, the time off in between shifts, and what we do with that time off in between. Lots of industries, okay, whether it's transportation, a lot of transportation industry, whether it's truck driving, pilots, train operators, have developed regulations in recent years about how much time you have to have off in between your shifts. Do you guys have that stuff? All right. So, pilots do? Okay. So, you have to be guaranteed that you have 16 hours off in between flights or something like that. That's fine, but that's the extent that we can regulate this. Because you know what? I have no control over what you do in that 16 hours off. And while it might allow for a good sleep, it might allow for an adequate quantity of sleep, there's a lot of other things going on in life that seem to compete with our need to sleep. Right? Someone mentioned here, how much sleep do we want to have? Well, we want to have 8 hours of sleep per night. That's fine. What gets in the way of that? Life. Life, simultaneously, several people said life. Yeah, we've got families. We've got errands to run. We've got chores around the house. We've got kids to take care of. We've got all kinds of things which suddenly zap away the amount of time that we have said to ourselves we're going to get relative to the amount of sleep that we might need. Just goofing around, all right? How many times have you been playing on a computer, playing some kind of game, or playing some video games, or watching a television show, and you think, I should be going to bed, all right? But I'm just going to stay up another hour here and finish this up here, or watch the end of this movie, or I'm going to play this game just until I beat this person or something like that. These are the things that are very important for us to take into consideration, because if we don't prioritize sleep, then this whole thing has a potential for falling apart. And we don't. We cognitively say we're going to, but lots of things compete with it, and we end up getting 7 hours, 6 hours, 5 hours of sleep per day. Let's see what this is. Back to our pilots here. The average length of a shift on the job. This is where the pilots came in pretty bad, all right? You'll see that 48% of them fall into this category where their shifts are somewhere between 9 to 12 hours a day, which is about the same for truck drivers, but more so than the other transportation industry there, and significantly more so than your control group of non-transportation people who were assessed in this same survey. So long shifts obviously are going to what? Take you further away from your last episode of sleep and leave you sleepier. And then you have the hours off in between shifts. We see the pilots over there, 52% of them are falling into this category here, which is 12 hours or more off. That's good, all right? But 43% of them are falling into this 8 to 12 hours off in between shifts. All right, so you have 8 to 12 hours off in between shifts. That doesn't really allow for 8 hours of sleep and getting everything else done in life that we need to get done. The other thing that I want to talk about relative to this homeostatic drive to sleep is that it's not just how long it's been since the last episode of sleep, but it's how good was that sleep and how much of it was there. So you can have 8 hours of crappy sleep. It ain't going to get you very far throughout the day. Or you can have a night of insufficient sleep of 4 hours or so, and that's not going to get you very far into the day either. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but these are the main sleep disorders that we deal with in the world of sleep and sleep centers to take a look at the quality of sleep. Perhaps the most common one and the one most spoken about these days is obstructive sleep apnea. Are most of you familiar with what obstructive sleep apnea is? It's a disorder of breathing that occurs during sleep. Your airway down here in your throat is a pretty rigid tube during the daytime because you have nerves and muscles that keep it open wide. When you sleep at night, those nerves and muscles turn off, and what is a rigid tube during daytime hours becomes a flexible, collapsible tube at night. And that tube, that airway, can close off on itself, obstruct the flow of air in and out, causing what's called an episode of sleep apnea. Now, when people have episodes of sleep apnea, they don't have 2, 3, or 4. They generally have 100 or 150 or 300, 400. Numbers get quite high sometimes. Each time you have an episode of apnea, you got 2 consequences, basically. 1, they wake you up, so it completely destroys the quality of your sleep. 2, causes a great strain on your cardiovascular system and can lead to a whole variety of cardiovascular consequences. But to stay on the topic of alertness, we're concerned mostly about what sleep apnea does to the quality of our sleep. And this is a common disorder. About 5 to 10% of the population has a significant degree of obstructive sleep apnea. Seems to be getting worse. It's very highly related to weight. And you know that as a population, we're not getting thinner here in the United States. So it is increasing, and it's a huge deal out there. Restless leg syndrome is a kind of a strange disorder. It causes kind of difficult to describe feelings in your legs or other extremities of your body. It's not necessarily painful. It's kind of a creepy, crawly, jittery feeling, an inability to keep your legs still. You want to move them. Movement of the legs makes that feeling go away, but movement of your legs is generally not too conducive to sleeping well. So it is much more common than we originally thought, and increasing in its frequency as well as we get better attuned to asking the right questions of patients. A variety of medical conditions, pain syndromes, lots of medications can impact the quality of the sleep that we get at night. So we have not only how far has it been since the last time we slept, but what's the quality of that sleep when we got it to determine how alert and refreshed we're going to feel during the daytime hours. I think I already said that. That's what it looks like. Here's your open airway. Here's your closed airway at night. One of the big culprits is our tongue, which slides backwards when we're in a prone position, supine position, excuse me. And further obstructs this airway, as well as these things here Your soft palate gets enlarged, your uvula, that's the thing that hangs down the back of your throat, gets enlarged, the whole thing gets clogged, and basically you need kind of a roto-rooter job to clear that out. The second component of all this is called your circadian rhythm or your circadian drive for wakefulness. Now your homeostatic drive I talked about before is the drive to get sleepy, 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 sleepy across the day. The circadian system kicks off in the morning and says, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. So as this one's getting stronger, so is this one getting stronger, and it maintains wakefulness. That's a good thing. So in general, and this probably applies only to you people who have some kind of a regular schedule in this room, but in general, you're going to be more alert at noon than you were at 9 o'clock this morning. You're going to be more alert at 7 o'clock this evening than you are going to be at 2 this afternoon. That kind of idea is what's happening when it comes to the circadian drive for wakefulness. In here, and again, if your schedules, all of this is determined by regularity of schedules. So if your schedule's screwed up, this is screwed up. But in regular people, do I have any regular people in this room? In regular people who have kind of first shift jobs, all right, this takes off in the morning, wakes us up. But then we got this little dip in the afternoon about 3 o'clock where the circadian drive pulls back a little bit. And most people get incredibly sleepy around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As I said, I'm a psychologist by my original training, and I see patients in my office for psychotherapy. And you don't want to see me at 3 in the afternoon, okay? Because I might fake like I'm concerned about your problem, yeah? But really I'm trying to stay awake. And trust me, listening to somebody talk at you for listening to somebody talk at you for 60 minutes at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's not the easiest thing sometimes. So actually I try to avoid scheduling patients at that time for that reason. I always think this is an interesting concept because lots of people think, oh my God, I'm so tired, I have to go home and get a nap in here in order to get through the rest of my day. You don't need to sleep here to feel better here. It's a natural rhythm that will go away. And so when people are having struggles sleeping at night or have basic insomnia and can't fall asleep at night, they really need to avoid sleeping here because if you sleep here, then your homeostatic drive gets a little bit satisfied and it's not as strong at bedtime as you want it to be. So that natural circadian rhythm and the dip in the middle of the afternoon is a real important thing to watch out for, and it's an incredibly important thing to watch out for transportation-wise. If we look at when people have accidents on the road, car accidents, there are 2 peaks of times where they have accidents. 4 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon. Those are the 2 peak times for automobile accidents. And you can see how it relates to the big dip at night, but also the small dip in the afternoon relative to this wakefulness mechanism. This is also what interferes with your ability to go home and go to sleep in the early morning hours after you've worked all night. Because despite the fact that you've worked an 8-hour shift or a 12-hour shift and you're exhausted, you lay yourself in bed at this time in the morning here, the circadian system still says, wake up, wake up, wake up. And so a lot of you probably have had the experience of going home, being exhausted, sleeping for 3 or 4 hours, and then waking up and being unable to have another 4 hours of decent sleep thereafter. Homeostatic drive is pretty powerful here and will allow you to get some sleep, but then this one starts interfering about noon or so and messes up your sleep for the rest of the day. And you know, when you're talking about sleeping during the daytime, it's a difficult thing. If I happen to wake up at 2 in the morning, I can't go out and mow the lawn, all right? I don't have that option. If you wake up at noon after trying to sleep during the day, things start going through your head where it's like, I got to go to the store, I got to get the lawn mowed, I got to do some laundry. There's all these things, these lists of activities and chores that start coming into people's minds. And so it becomes, I might as well get the hell up here and just get some things done rather than lay in bed, tossing and turning for the rest of the time. You have your circadian system to thank for that phenomenon. All right, a little shift here. I've done quite a bit of work, we've done quite a bit of work in the Mercy system with our occupational health department, in particular truck drivers. And so so I've done some work here with medical examiners, and this comes from their regulatory statements. The obligation of the medical examiner is to establish whether a driver has a disease, a disorder, or an injury resulting in a higher than acceptable likelihood for gradual or sudden incapacitation or sudden death, thus endangering the public safety. That sounds nice, right? So they have to have a disease, a disorder, or an injury. Now, sleep apnea is a disorder, okay? 5 to 10% of the population have it. Narcolepsy is another sleep disorder, really rare, 0.02% of the population have that. What I'm interested in are not these diseases and disorders. I'm interested in what's happening to all of us on a regular basis. Something we call inadequate sleep hygiene, insufficient sleep syndrome. Right? Most of you have insufficient sleep syndrome. You're not getting enough sleep on a regular basis. Inadequate sleep hygiene, just doing stupid things that are non-conducive to sleep. Pumping yourself up on caffeine all day, taking naps in the middle of the afternoon, flooding yourself with bright lights in the evening hours, all those things that work against having good sleep. So my concern, or my point that I keep trying to make to people is, yes, I'm concerned about sleep apnea. Yes, I'm concerned about those specific diseases that people have. But I'm most concerned about what everybody's doing out there in terms of bad sleep habits and how it impacts all of these things that we've been talking about here. We are all incapacitated by a night or two of bad sleep. All right. Here's an interesting research study. I don't have it up here. I guess if I can remember it. It came out earlier this year, and it was very neurological. It was in a neurological journal, which is not a place that I frequent all that often. But it goes like this. It was a study with mice. And what it showed is that a single night of insufficient sleep kills off brain cells in mice. And so the habit that we have as Americans to shortchange ourselves during our work week and catch up on the weekends or on our days off might feel good, but it doesn't save us from the neurological impairment that takes place on any given night when we're not getting enough sleep. So we're killing off brain cells night by night when we have inadequate sleep. We might physiologically feel better by catching up, but we don't get those brain cells back. Now this is mice stuff, all right? But we're going to move into the direction of looking at that same phenomenon in terms of humans, and I hate to think of what it means in terms of counting the brain cells that we're all trying to function with these days. What I'm talking about here is a concept that we sleep people call latent sleepiness, all right? Now latent sleepiness is what's under the surface. We all walk around with what has been called a sleep debt, all right, which is sleepiness that's under the surface. It doesn't show up on a regular basis, okay? I mean, you look pretty alert. You don't. You look pretty alert over here, okay? There's a guy over here who looks like he's ready to go into stage 1 sleep, all right? But we all have a certain degree of latent sleepiness because most of us are not getting enough sleep in general. What does it take for that latent sleepiness then to rise to the surface, to rear its ugly head and create true sleep? And the answer is not much, okay? Boredom, sometimes heat, like a hot room. All right, how many of you have fallen asleep during a sermon at church? Come on. All right, when we are not actively engaged in some kind of stimulating activity, latent sleepiness tends to rise to the surface. Driving a car doesn't require much of us. All right, how many of you can adequately recall how you got here this morning, every step of the way? All right, not much, because you're not paying attention to a lot of things. Driving a car is what psychologists call an overlearned behavior, all right, which is we do it so many times we don't have to think about it. That's not good, because we're not stimulating our brain. And so this latent sleepiness can come about as we're behind the wheel of a car because of the monotony and the boredom which is inevitable in that situation. Okay. This gets back to that balance, that tipping point that I was talking about earlier, which is sleepiness intrudes into wakefulness, generally with very little warning. All right? Now, when I talk about people falling asleep behind the wheel of a car or while flying a plane or a helicopter, I'm not talking about taking a 20-minute nap. I'm talking about 3 seconds of being asleep. All right? How much does it take to cause a problem? I don't have the answer to that, but I suspect not much. Okay, these are what we call micro sleeps, which they just kind of come over us. All right, some of you might have them already this morning. All right, they're micro sleeps. They're 2-3 seconds of sleep where we lose it. And if we were under different situations where it was dark and cozy and comfortable, we'd probably extend that into a full episode of sleep. All right, let's take this one here. 2007, a 39-year-old male was charged with aggravated child molestation against a 7-year-old female as she slept in his home. The defendant had a history of inappropriate sexual behavior during sleep with his wife, as well as numerous episodes of general sleepwalking and talking. Testimony confirmed that the man had ingested both alcohol and antihistamines prior to sleep that night. The defendant further stated, "I had been dead asleep and had no idea what I was doing." After 5 days of testimony and expert witnesses, the jury took little more than 2 hours to acquit the defendant on all charges. You'll love this one. A young Canadian male was acquitted in the murder of his mother-in-law using a sleepwalking defense. On the night of the death, he arose from bed, drove, get this, 14 miles to the house of his in-laws, strangled his father-in-law until the man passed out. He then bludgeoned his mother-in-law with a tire iron and stabbed them both with a kitchen knife. The woman died, the man barely survived. The man arrived at the police station dazed and confused about what had happened and bloody from severed tendons he sustained in both hands during the attack. Citing a strong family history of parasomnias, we'll get to that in a second, experts testified that the man had been sleepwalking during the attack, and he was ultimately found not guilty. All right, parasomnias are those weird behaviors that people do during the night. They talk in their sleep, they walk in their sleep, some people have sex in their sleep, some people eat in their sleep, all kinds of abnormal behaviors which creep into the sleep period. What happens in these situations is that there's an activation back in the brainstem of your nervous system, which activates certain receptor sites in your brainstem. They generally are the appetites that we have, okay? The appetite for food, for sex, for aggression, all those impulses that we have to do something tend to get activated. Emotional things get activated as well. What we don't have during these episodes of parasomnias is the use of our frontal cortex, our brain here, which tells us what's right and wrong, what we should do and not do, which understands the consequences of our behavior. And so we act on these impulses without full use of our brain to say, it may not be a smart thing for me to be doing right now. Maybe I shouldn't get in the car and go bludgeon my mother-in-law. Perhaps. All right. Judgment comes from your cortex, all right? And that's what we have when we're awake. But when we don't have enough sleep, or when we're in a situation like this where we have these parasomnias, where we're half awake and half asleep, we don't have the judgment that's afforded to us by our frontal cortex. Why am I talking about parasomnias in the midst of this whole thing? Because I want you to come away with this with the concept that you can have good sleep over there, sound sleep. You can have complete wakefulness over here. And you could have a messy gray area in between where we're partially awake and partially asleep. There's a concept here called local sleep, which I tend to love, which is by a guy named Dr. Kruger from Washington State. Individual parts of the brain, perhaps even single nerves, go to sleep at different times depending on how much they've been used lately. We talk about people falling asleep, all right? How do you know if somebody's falling asleep? All right, well, they might lay their head down on the desk, their eyes will be closed, their breathing might become a little bit more relaxed or slowed down, and we say, he's asleep. Right? But what if that's just the ultimate culmination of several steps before that, where your brain's shutting off in little pieces, bit by bit, until we reach that critical mass, and at that point, we are considered soundly asleep. That's what's interesting here. This concept, which is not believed by everybody, I think it has a great deal of utility, tells us that pieces of your brain can basically shut off. All right? If you want to say fall asleep, fine. If you want to say shut off, that's fine too. And the pieces that fall asleep are the ones that we use over and over and over again in the course of our workday. So let's say you have a repetitive kind of job where you're sitting in front of a computer and you're entering data, and you're using the same piece of your brain over and over and over again. At some point, it's like, I can't do this anymore. And we've all experienced that. I mean, particularly if you're having trouble getting a resolution to a problem that you're having, or maybe you're trying to write a paper or do a homework assignment or something on your job where you're stuck, all right? Because you've just been looking at it too long, you've been thinking about it too much, and smartly so, we sometimes say, I'm just going to go sleep on it. And I come back the next morning and I'm thinking more clearly about it and the answers come, or I can make progress on this project that I'm working on. That's what we're talking about here. When you use some piece of your brain over and over and over again during the day, it'll shut off. That is not too good relative to perhaps taking care of a patient or flying a helicopter or whatever else you all do in this room. I guess that gets to the point here, gets us away from the whole either-or phenomena, this black-white phenomena that we're awake or asleep, and really gets to the point of part of our brains are capable of being awake while part of our brains are capable of being asleep. And how good are we at doing and how safe are we at doing our jobs when we're in this middle gray zone? Not too, I would suspect. And so we talk about things, as I said before, specific diseases that we can look at. That's kind of the easy part. We can emphasize the quantity of sleep that people get before the start of work and the consistency of their schedules. That's important as well. And we also need to look at the time of day phenomena when it comes to how capable are we of doing our job safely at any given point throughout the day. All right, so we're switching to part 2 here, or maybe part 3. What are we going to do about this? About 3 years ago, I started something called the Worker Fatigue Initiative at Mercy. And it was pulling together people from different departments to start talking about this problem relative to the safety of our patients primarily, and the safety of our employees. And so this means HR people and risk management people and quality people and accreditation people and all those people from all the hospitals to start determining what can we do to pay attention to this. Joint Commission has had on their back burner a fatigue initiative. You know about the National Patient Safety Goals the Joint Commission has. All right, they've had on a back burner that this is going to be one of them one of these years, so we wanted to get a bit of a jump start on that here at Mercy. So the first thing we start talking about is work schedules. And you guys sound like the worst of the lot. Is that true? I mean, you don't know what the rest of the world is doing here at Mercy, but some of you in the room have normal first shift, 8 to 5 kind of schedules? Nobody? No?
No, we're a 24/7 operation, so.
Everybody?
Except for a lot of mechanics.
Mechanics, okay. Is over here? You? Mechanic? Yeah. All right, an office. Okay. So I don't know what the answers are to this. All right, I'm not standing before you saying I have an answer for this. I have no concept how to run your department. Who's in charge of this department? You are? Good luck with that. The whole 12-hour shift for nurses, as you were saying, nurses love 12-hour shifts, all right? I mean, just even your basic hospital nurses love 12-hour shifts because they could work 3 days and have 4 days off, or they could work 3 days and get a second job somewhere else. It's very conducive. But I run sleep centers, all right, and sleep technicians obviously work at night, and they work 12-hour shifts, 3 12-hour shifts a week. I watch them get increasingly more fatigued as those days go on, all right? They come in on Sunday night, which is their first night, they're pretty good. By Tuesday morning, they're dragging anchor, and they got to get through Tuesday night yet. So I can see it going downhill. There hasn't been enough time for sleep and recuperation in between their shifts, and so it's a gradual downhill climb towards exhaustion, and then they recoup on their days off, as I'm sure that you guys do as well. So getting employee buy-in on this is not easy either. I could sit up here and talk about what's good for our health and our safety, but employees have their own issues too relative to the kind of shifts that they want to work. So we're looking at work schedules and hours of work for people as part of this initiative too. We're looking at how much overtime people get, what's the maximum number of hours per week they can work, hours per day, how much on call are they, time off between shifts, and things of that sort. We're also looking for a fitness of duty policy, all right? You can't come to work drunk, sir. You can't.
Sorry.
All right. Hey, but you can come to work sleep deprived. You know what? You might feel like you're kind of drunk, or you might behave in a drunken manner, but we can't take your blood and test that. So how do we assess people for their fitness for duty relative to this sleep question? Very, very tricky. I mean, there are sophisticated performance tests and computerized tests that you can give people to see if their reaction times are good and stuff like that, but that we're light years away from doing that for our average employee. We are capable of doing it for somebody who's drunk when they come into work, somebody who's maybe emotionally distressed when they come into work, but this kind of determination of sleepiness and fatigue, we have very poor means of assessing that relative to showing up for work and putting in a safe day of work. All right, education, that's what this is about here, all right? About the best thing I can do, about the only thing that I felt I could sink my teeth in is to get out there and educate employees of Mercy as to what this is all about and how they ought to be sleeping more and doing better and getting better sleep. So I do that all the time. Keep consistent bedtimes and wake times. Sorry, I know you can't, but that is one of the main recommendations we make to people. Ensure sufficient time in bed, setting sleep as a priority over the other things in your life, relaxing before sleep. I think that's huge, all right? All right, now I'm a psychologist, so I'm kind of big on this whole relaxation stuff. But what happens when you come home after a 24-hour shift? All right.
It depends on what your shift looks like.
Okay. So let's say you're real busy. I'm sorry to pick on you, but you did raise your hand early in the process here, so. And I know you're shy, right? Yeah, okay. Let's say you had a real busy night. Let's say you had a real busy night, all kinds of stuff going on, and you go home. You're exhausted, right? All right. Do you throw yourself in bed? Okay. Does it work? Okay. Damn.
I'm lucky. I'm good. I worked the night shift for years, and I really never had a lot
Okay.
of problems. But like you said, you sleep 3 or 4 hours, and then you're up because you have things to do.
Yeah. Well, the point to be made here is that I'm a first shift guy, all right? So I go home at about 6 o'clock every evening. I don't go to bed till 10:30. Right? So I have 4 hours there to kind of chill out, get some things done, stop, relax, prepare myself to, be in a non-stressed, relaxed state before I hit bed. Lots of people who have crazy shifts or prolonged shifts are so exhausted when they come home that they just throw themselves into bed without any kind of decompression time. Now, sometimes that works because it could be a long time since the last time they slept. But sometimes that doesn't work because one of the biggest problems that Americans make is they think physical exhaustion is the same as sleepiness, and they are not the same at all. And so to throw yourself in bed because you're physically exhausted does not mean you're throwing yourself in bed because you're sleepy, and sleepiness is going to determine how this all goes. If you're exhausted, you need to relax. You need to sit down. You need to rest. You need to put your feet up. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to throw yourself in bed and turn off the lights. And when you combine the two of those things, chances are you'll get a few hours of sleep, and then you'll start waking up because your body still is kind of on overdrive and hasn't decompressed in the way that it's supposed to before you lay your head down at night. So that's part of the big problem here when it comes to these pre-sleep rituals and preparing ourselves best for bed, particularly when you have a chaotic or erratic work schedule. Avoidance of wake-promoting agents like caffeine, et cetera, and a good environment. We talk about the problems with shift work, okay? I have this, as I was going to say, I have these technicians that work for me, and there's a group of them that like to work in the dark all night. And I come in sometimes like, why don't you turn on some lights? Oh, it bothers our eyes, et cetera, et cetera. Most people, when they're working nights, like to have the lights up, okay? Light is a stimulating effect. Light suppresses the release of melatonin in your body, and melatonin has a sleep-inducing property to it. So if you want your melatonin to shut off, get yourself under bright lights like this. If you want your melatonin to come up to the surface and do what it's supposed to do, then live in dim light conditions. So paying attention to those things are critically important when you're talking about shift work, as well as the other points I've already made. We're going to try to diagnose and treat sleep disorders in our employee population. Okay, so we're trying to get out there and do an explanation of what sleep apnea is and get people studied and on treatment for that if necessary. Environmental changes, I think I may have covered this already, but what can we do to help people get through nighttime hours? What can we help people do to get through extended work shifts when sleepiness is likely to be impacting their behavior and their performance? Already said that. How about this? You guys have, where do you hang out? Where do you work?
Like 5 feet.
Okay. And are there sleeping arrangements there? Okay. Bed, rooms? Is it like a firehouse? That's my only frame of reference here. Okay. I think that's important because when we talk about other departments in this hospital system, all right, we don't have beds. So do you let people nap? All right. Now, yes, you do. Okay. You don't even call it a nap. I'm sure it's just it's your normal sleep. But what about somebody who's in a more traditional office arrangement? Do we let them take a 15-minute nap when they have their break during the daytime? Some people think that that's wrong, or you don't want to encourage that on the job. I happen to think it's right. All right? If you need a 10-minute nap, if you're a power napper who can get something out of a 10-minute nap and it gets you through the rest of your day more alert, more productive, and more safe, what's wrong with that? But that's a struggle to overcome when we tried to change some of the policies around Mercy and other places. Let me zip through this. Caffeine. How much caffeine goes on in this group here? Lots? Okay. Any of you take Provigil or Nuvigil? No? Provigil and Nuvigil are medications that were approved over the last 10 years to promote wakefulness. That's all it does, keep people awake. Primarily, it was first initiated for patients with narcolepsy, then patients with shift work disorder, and now some patients with sleep apnea. It's been approved for. And the advantage of Nuvigil and Provigil is that it's quite effective, and also it does not have the long half-life that caffeine has. Caffeine has a long half-life, so if you're pumping yourself with caffeine at 4 in the morning to get through the rest of your work shift, it's still in your system when you're going to lay your head in bed at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and it's going to fight against your ability to sleep well during those daytime hours. Provigil, Nuvigil, pretty safe, pretty well-tolerated medications. Seems to be, you can take it at the beginning of a night shift, it's gone by morning time, you can go home and go to bed without that interfering with your ability to fall or stay asleep. There it is, right there. Didn't know it was coming. Staff strategies, who do we talk to if we're not doing well, if we're too sleepy to be doing what we're doing? Do we talk to a staff member? Do we talk to a colleague and say, I need some help here, can I have a break? Do we speak about this, all right? Or do we keep it silent, like, no, not me, I'm okay, I don't have this problem, when really we're struggling with our alertness during our work shift? And that's part of that, and that's part of that, and we're done, and I need to spend 10 minutes on questions, I would assume, right? Right?
And I guess the one question, we work, the medical crews work out that 24-hour shift. I guess what are some strategies if they get busy during that shift? And we do have a timeout policy where crews are allowed to call a timeout.
What does that mean, timeout?
Anybody want to explain? Feel comfortable explaining that?
You get 22 hours, or 2 hours for a crew are down for 2 hours with no expectation of a transport. From the time they get back to their quarters, they've got 2 hours of complete downtime before they call it.
After every trip?
If they call a timeout.
If they call timeout. And what do you have to get to call a timeout? Just your own personal decision?
Yes.
Right, so you could say, I'm
Any one of the crew members can call it, and it applies to the entire crew.
Is there a stigma around that, or is it something that's used easily?
There used to be, because we used to take the other crew members off the clock. So there was a conflict of interest, so we changed that. There is probably still a stigma. People,
Because you're taking a break with somebody else.
right, the
back to work.
other trucks or aircraft aren't too appreciative of it, because that increases potentially their workload.
So there is a pressure not to take this time out.
There's also the pressure to man up and do your job.
There's a I get stuck on that concept because I do think that there's a bravado that comes out in American culture that sleepiness is for wimps, okay, and sleep it. And if we're tough, we just plow through this thing. I mean, even if we look at the mid-afternoon dip in our alertness, okay, other cultures go home and take a nap, all right? They take a siesta. But not us Americans now, we'll just plow right through it. We don't care if we're hurting people or if we're getting in accidents. So there is that man-up piece of it, which is very prominent when it comes to the world of sleep and sleepiness. You know, it's an interesting, what do you do? Okay, my first answer to this is not one you're gonna like. The remedy for sleepiness is sleep, okay? You're looking for alternatives, all right? You're looking for, I'll go for a walk out in the freezing cold, all right? Yeah, all right, that'll do a little bit. You're looking for, you know, do I drink another cup of coffee? But I have to say, as a voice of expertise in this area, that the only solution for sleepiness is sleep. So how do you incorporate that into your work schedule? And the timeout thing is, are you allowed then to go nap for a couple hours if you take a timeout?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be the expectation if you did call a timeout. Don't take that time to do a chart. Don't take that time to do anything. Take a nap. You know, if you're that tired, then please take a nap because you're going to make us safe. So.
One of the recommendations we make for drowsy driving is pull off to the side of the road, quickly down a cup of coffee, take a 10-15 minute nap before the coffee kicks in, and then get back on the road so that you got kind of a double helper there in terms of getting some sleep and having caffeine in your system, all right? Rather than just keep the constant coffee going, which has its own drawbacks. And if you think about caffeine sometimes, it doesn't take away sleepiness. It doesn't allow you to sleep, but it doesn't take away sleepiness. It's still under the surface. What will happen is that you could very easily have coffee, lay your head down, and fall asleep. It'll just be crappy sleep. So it kind of masks sleepiness, and it's not a great solution for it in that way. And I would encourage you to look into the new Vigil, Pro Vigil stuff. It's quite effective, safe, well tolerated, and does a much better job than your constant coffee. Other thoughts, sir?
Real quick, Doctor, is there any research done about folks that have done the same type of job, same type of shift over so many years, how the body adjusts to the sleep?
The body can adjust to an alternate sleep schedule based on work if that remains consistent, okay? So there is quite a bit of research would tell you that if somebody's routinely on third shift, all these rhythms shift to a different time of the day as long as that remains consistent. The worst thing is rotating shifts, okay? Where you're gonna move first shift for 2 weeks and then second shift and then third shift. It's terrible because you never get in an established pattern. And there are some people who simply don't have the strength of these rhythms, and that's kind of good if your schedule's bad. In other words, they can adjust pretty well regardless of where they throw their work and where they throw their sleep. But it's consistency, regardless of where you put it in a day, that seems to be the driving force behind whether or not somebody does well on an alternate work schedule. Other questions? Everybody sleeping good? Sir?
Just kind of curious on you mentioned about in a 24-hour period, 8 hours, if you would use 8 hours. And if you divided that up over that 24 hours, I mean, how does that correlate back? So if you would do, 5 hours work and 3 hours sleep, if you do something like that through 24 hours, I'm curious, any studies that says, hey, that's 75% of what a normal would be?
You mean doing things in chunks?
Yeah, because
neatly?
a lot of times, I'm sitting there thinking, if I go on, and a lot of these guys are full-time there, but if I know I'm going in, I usually go to bed a little earlier the night before because I know what could happen, maybe get a little more sleep, come in, get our safety nap in, and ideally if we get skunked that day, then all of a sudden I go away with more sleep than I would have had otherwise. But I'm just kind of curious how that goes.
It's an interesting question. The ultimate goal should be getting enough sleep, all right? And if that is only available to you in a piecemeal fashion, that's better than just, trying to put 4 hours of sleep in the nighttime hours. So there is some advantage to a cumulative quantity of sleep before you head into work. I guess the other thought I would have is that when it comes to shift workers, we often recommend that they do go home in the morning and sleep for some chunk of time. But most shift workers, let's say you're working night shifts, we also recommend they take another nap, extended nap prior to sleep, prior to going into work. And the reason for that is, gets back to that homeostatic drive, which is you're going to be sleepier the longer away you are from your last episode of sleep. So if you can put sleep right before you go into work, then you're not going to have a long stretch, since your last sleep period that earlier morning, which is, again, similar to how my lifestyle would work, having my nice, easy shift that you people remind me that I have, where I sleep all night, and then I get up at 6:30 in the morning, and I'm in the office at 7:30. So I'm at work very close to my last episode of sleep, and that's what you want to do. I guess the other comment would be the amount of time that these pieces come at you, these pieces of sleep. There's something called sleep cycles, right? Where you go to sleep, light stage of sleep, you get increasingly deeper, you come back out into a light stage of sleep, and then you go into your first episode of dream sleep. That's a cycle, that's about 90 minutes. All right, so you kind of want to think in 90-minute cycles. That's the best way to get sleep. A half hour sometimes puts people right at the deepest point of their sleep, which is very hard to wake up from and feel good. You feel physically bad, you're mentally sluggish. So, when we talk about how you can parcel out sleep across the 24-hour day, if you need to do it that way, I would encourage you to think in those kind of 90-minute chunks. Okay, I'll sleep an hour and a half here, I'll sleep 3 hours here if I can, but avoiding those kind of off times that disrupt the cycling of the cycling of sleep is very useful in terms of its restorative value and how it feels to the person. I'm not sure that kind of got your question. Other thoughts, questions, comments? All wide awake? What else are you guys doing here today?
We've actually got Mr. Sutton. Actually, can everybody give Dr. Neeb a round?
All right.